February 22nd, 1987, Andy Warhol, the prince of pop art, dies unexpectedly at age 58.
I mean, his death is gruesome.
Nobody should die from a routine operation, especially Andy Warhol.
His passing sets a fierce battle in motion.
These were new, treacherous waters for me.
That calls into question the value of his unique brand of art and pits Andy's closest allies against one another in a vicious cash grab.
Eventually, the numbers in this estate reached intergalactic proportions.
I was going to make an awful lot of money. I'm not saying I'm an angel, but I don't want to get robbed, okay?
Money brings out the worst in everybody, and this fight really did it.
February 1987, Andy Warhol, the iconoclastic painter and filmmaker, dies in New York hospital before sunrise. Andy's good friend Stuart Pivar knows something is wrong when Andy doesn't call to go on their usual Sunday flea market outing. Concerned, Pivar phones the advertising director of Andy's magazine. Interview.
I called Paige Powell early in the morning, and I said, "How come Andy didn't call?" And she said, "'Cause he's dead." And that was the way I received that devastating news.
Just 58 years old, Andy Warhol is known for creating some of the most enduring images of our time. Warhol once said, "In the future, everyone will be world famous for 15 minutes." But he stayed in the limelight for far longer. He lived like a superstar, but in the end, he dies humbly from a heart attack after routine gallbladder surgery. Jeffrey Warhola is Andy's nephew.
I never seen my father cry until February 22nd, 1987, when he got the news and Andy had died, you know. And I remember him just turning to me in tears and saying, that's my younger brother, you know. That was my younger brother.
Hospital staff call Fred Hughes, Andy's longtime business manager and the executor of his estate, and perhaps the most important figure in Andy Warhol's life.
Fred Hughes was Andy's business manager. And of course, it was obvious that it was Fred who turned Andy's artistic venture into the colossal business empire that it was, because Fred was able to get the clientele and organize the way it should be and set the stage for the colossal artistic events that would happen.
Fred Hughes immediately calls his friend Edward Hayes, a fast-talking attorney. Hayes springs into action.
I wanted a challenge. I wanted to help a lot of people, and I wanted to make a lot of money. Now, I'm not sure if that's the order that I thought about, but those are roughly the three things.
Christopher Byron covers the story for New York Magazine.
They needed a lawyer for the estate, and Fred Hughes was the executor of the estate, and his first choice was out of town that weekend. So he said, well, you know, there's always Eddie. So they went for Ed Hayes, and the next thing you know, he was collecting millions, and that's how that happened.
Just hours after Andy dies, Hayes meets Hughes at Warhol's 5-story Georgian townhouse. They need to get a handle on the size of the artist's estate, starting with clutter from years of shopping sprees. Andy Warhol's cache of collectibles spills out of closets and up to the chandeliers.
He liked to trade for things, and he enjoyed the shop, and Warhol was an exceptional person, and he had exceptional taste.
One might ask, was Andy a hoarder? We didn't know that word in those days.
Andy collects everything from stamps to cookie jars to classical busts.
His home was, for the time, a completely unique type of apartment where every single one of the rooms was a perfect, magnificent period room.
And he had a lot of stuff, beautiful jewelry, beautiful watches.
Hayes and Hughes count 19 wooden toilet seats.
Andy Warhol hated toilet seats if they weren't wooden. Every toilet in his house, every toilet in his summer house had a wooden seat. It was all wooden.
There are treasures at every turn.
Hughes and I are cleaning out a closet, all right? And I throw this one painting out onto the floor, and Hughes goes crazy. He says, "Do you know what you did?" I said, "I don't have the vaguest idea of what I just did." He says, "That's a Renoir." I said, "That's a Renoir? Holy smoke, I can't even spell Renoir." All I know is it's very valuable.
It's not just other artists' masterpieces stashed away. 60 of Andy Warhol's own silk screens are rolled up in a pitch-dark room.
Hughes almost fainted. He couldn't. That's where Warhol kept some of his most valuable stuff in the house, was in this little sort of dirty room right underneath the attic, right down the hall from the maze room.
From Andy's collection to his own creations, Fred Hughes and Ed Hayes see they are sitting on a gold mine.
It was overwhelming in terms of the scale of things. I'm a fairly resolute person, so I wasn't intimidated.
Andy Warhol's will leaves $250,000 to his manager Hughes, and to each of his brothers, John and Paul Warhola. The rest of his estate, however much that amounts to, is to fund a charitable foundation for the arts.
He was basically a charitable man. He adored glamour, he adored the upper classes. There was never a degenerate rich person that he didn't want to have in his entourage. But he basically had a good heart.
The size of Andy's estate is not yet clear, but it's evident Andy Warhol has come a long way from very humble beginnings. August 6, 1928, Andrew Warhola is born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to working-class immigrants from eastern Slovakia. In a tough town full of steelworkers and coal miners, young Andy doesn't fit in.
Warhol was a sickly kid from Pittsburgh. He was skinny. Pittsburgh at the time had some of the biggest shouldered men you've ever seen in your life.
Andy wasn't like a sports type person. He wasn't out there on a basketball court or playing baseball. So his hobbies, that's what he loved to do, was sit down and just draw and sketch.
An outcast at school, Andy spends endless hours in his room sketching and collecting pictures of movie stars.
You know, he would send letters to different stars asking for a signed photo, and he did receive one back, and he did this with many stars of the day.
The family has high hopes for young Andy. When Andy is a teenager, his father falls ill. On his deathbed, he makes a final plea to Andy's older brother, John.
He said, "I have so many thousands of dollars in postal bonds that I have saved. Use it for Andy's college." You know, so my grandfather had this insight that he was going to be something someday because he was different.
The family lore proves correct. In 1949, after studying pictorial design, Andy moves to the big city.
It's very impressive to me the way Andy went with, I believe, $500 in 1949 to New York, a degree from Carnegie Tech, and the rest, like they say, is history.
By the end of the 50s, Andy is the most highly regarded and paid commercial artist in New York.
You know, got contracts with, I believe, the New Yorker magazine and Izzy Miller Shoe Store, and began to rise up the ladder of success.
Andy draws for Glamour, Vogue, 17, and Harper's Bazaar. He does album covers for Columbia Records. After a popular series of shoe ads runs in the New York Times, Women's Wear Daily calls him the Leonardo da Vinci of Madison Avenue. Then he makes the transition to fine artist. Andy becomes one of the best-known and most controversial figures of the 20th century.
So he was an icon in this town, and everybody who was anybody either knew him or had a friend who knew him, and they all had opinions about him.
Andy's elevated status makes his untimely demise all the more shocking. News of his death soon reaches the factory, the swish Manhattan studio space Andy's used since 1984. In just a few hours, the factory is reportedly pillaged by hangers-on.
I wouldn't say there's thousands, but there was at least hundreds of people who claimed that they knew him at some point or another, and he had promised them a teacup, and they were there to get it.
Meanwhile, Andy's painting assistant adds the finishing touches and Andy's signature to canvases still in progress. The art world is abuzz.
It was kind of like a scene out of a movie. And the movie that sprang to my mind was the last scene in Zorba the Greek when this old woman died, and all the village women started rushing into her house and rummaging through her bureau drawers and pulling out her underwear and her lingerie and running home with it. And in a sense, that's what happened with the inventory taking of the Warhol estate.
Everybody wanted a piece of Andy Warhol.
It's shocking to some, but the race to grab Andy's millions is just getting started.
Like anything involving large sums of money, got bloody.
In Andy's world, art, celebrity, beauty, and commerce are one and the same.
Warhol had an empire of his own.
Nowhere embodies the brand of Andy Warhol more than the original factory, a studio space he establishes in 1963 in a converted warehouse. This is where artist Ultraviolet joins Andy's entourage of outrageous New York personalities who appeared in his films in the 60s, known as Warhol superstars. Her romance with the surrealist painter Salvador Dali has just ended, and she's ready for a new life.
Dali introduced me and he said, "This is Andy Warhol." I heard of him. He was quite unknown. And Andy said to me, "Oh, you're so very beautiful. I'd like to do a movie with you." I said, "Fine, tomorrow." So the next day I went to the factory.
Andy's original studio is called the Silver Factory because every imaginable surface is spray-painted silver or wrapped in aluminum foil.
And the door was open, so anyone could go in, whether they were collectors, socialite, drug addict, artist, superstar.
Celebrity sightings are just as common as discarded syringes.
So I met at the factory Tennessee Williams, Judy Garland, John Lennon, the Rolling Stone, Bob Dylan. I mean, the list is long. Anyone in the 60s that were a celebrity came through the factory.
If I have one regret, it's that I wasn't a few years older, that I could have popped in and surprised Andy at the factory and say, "Hey, Uncle Andy, what's going on?" You know, and met some of his cohorts. And I missed this period. You know, I was all of 10 years old, you know, during this time.
One of the regulars starts to call it the factory. Andy likes the idea so much that he calls all of his subsequent studios the factory. A place that manufactures art, ideas, and people.
When I met Andy Warhol, he said, "We have to change your name. My birth name is Isabelle Colin Dufresne." And you can imagine that in the United States, nobody can understand it or spell it or remember it. And in the 60s, everyone took pop name. And he said, "I want to call you Polly Esther." I did not like that either. And I said, "I'm going to find my own name."
Isabelle Dufresne is reborn, Ultraviolet. She joins the ranks of Viva, Candy Darling, and Edie Sedgwick, the Warhol superstars.
Andy was trying to beat Hollywood. And so the idea was that we were not star, but superstar. And even though we might have no talent, so Warhol promised fame. He said, I'll give you fame.
And he does, through films, photographs, paintings.
So to be a superstar and to be photographed, we would go out and the next day, we would go to bed at about 8 a.m. and buy all the newspaper and we were in the front page. So, we said, what for? What have we done? Well, really nothing, but just being there, being beautiful, sometimes few scandals.
Just about everyone in his ever-growing entourage comes from the party circuit. Whether it's his business manager, Fred Hughes, or the lawyer, Edward Hayes.
I first met Andy Warhol because I followed a woman. I had seen her in the street and I wanted to meet her. And she went to a party that Andy Warhol was at. And Andy Warhol pinched me. And frankly, I thought it was one thing to see me in a club at 3 o'clock in the morning, but to see one of the great figures of American history, of American art history in a club at 3 o'clock in the morning, made me wonder.
Throughout the 60s and 70s, Andy is a mainstay of the New York party circuit. But for him, it's all business.
He never drank. He never drank even coffee, nor tea, nor anything.
I think that Warhol really wanted very beautiful women to be surrounded with because I think, in retrospect, they were sort of bait, to attract the client or the collector or the whatever, or the money people.
Andy finds inspiration in everything.
He was always had the horror of running out of subjects to paint. He would say, oh, Stuart, what am I going to paint? And the flea market offered him unlimited kind of subject matter.
It's hard to tell whether Andy Warhol predicts trends, starts them, or both.
I always admired his dress, his boots, his leather jacket, and the hair, which I didn't realize was a wig, I thought he was cool looking.
Andy brought to the art situation a kind of pure, innocent naivete and honesty. His whole approach to doing things was very direct and without any kinds of cunning and that you associate with the art world.
It wasn't just that he was a great painter, which he was. He had a great analysis of that era of history. Electric chairs, civil rights riots, the soup cans.
Andy gets 2 memorial services. First, an open casket wake in Pittsburgh, his hometown.
And it was just a low-key Carpatho-Russin mass, funeral mass.
A second memorial service in New York a month later draws more than 2,000 mourners.
I was just awestruck by all the friends and associates that attended and the celebrities and the people I got to speak to and meet, Yoko Ono, Richard Gere, Bianca Jagger, Ultraviolet.
There was quite a crowd, mixed again, some people on back of me sniffing cocaine, and then a lot of famous people, of course, and a demented person that said, the monster is dead, the monster is dead. So it was a great, in a way, reunion of whoever was left of the factory. It was not sad at all.
He didn't attend Mass regularly because he didn't want to be, a celebrity in the crowd. He would go after the Mass and kneel in the back and say prayers. Not too many people know about this religious side and the big heart he had.
Andy wants other artists to have the same opportunity for success he's had, and he shows this generosity in his will.
All of the estate was to go to charity. Warhol had left everything to a foundation that was to be called the Andy Warhol Foundation, and the foundation was there to benefit art.
As estate executor, Fred Hughes' role is to add up the estate assets and sell them off. The proceeds are then to be transferred to the new foundation. But months after Andy's death, Fred Hughes and estate lawyer Ed Hayes still haven't figured out what those assets are worth.
The problem here was that Warhol was a very controversial figure when he died, and his position as an artist was very uncertain.
Even without knowing how much money it has to play with, The foundation is established and sets up a board of directors. The new foundation's board includes Fred Hughes and Andy's brother, John Warhol. Edward Hayes is appointed as general counsel to the foundation, in addition to being the estate attorney.
I had a self-interest, but the general public had an interest as well.
As estate executor, Hughes is to be paid 2% of the gross estate. Hayes negotiates the same fee for his services as a lawyer. The more money the estate is worth, the more they'll get paid. They think the gross figure could be up to $120 million. So they're expecting to make more than $2 million each.
Forget the idea that it was computed on a strict percentage. It was basically a success-oriented process.
For tax purposes, the estate needs an appraisal, and there's a lot of money at stake. The higher the sum total of Andy Warhol's assets and artwork, the greater the value of the foundation. But there could be a drawback to a wealthy foundation. To meet not-for-profit status, the foundation must give away 5% of its asset value to the state of New York each year. So Ed Hayes argues that the public stands to benefit from a high appraisal.
The best way for the public to be taken care of was for the assets to be properly sold and a proper appraisal. It was plenty of money for everybody, plenty of everything for everybody. All you had to do was sit down and honestly give everybody their share. But everybody wanted more than they were entitled to.
There's a legal showdown on the horizon, along with allegations of fraud, price fixing, and shady backroom deals.
He was a man who was worth probably $500 million, and they killed him.
After Andy Warhol's 1987 death, Fred Hughes and Ed Hayes take stock of the artist's estate. They see it's much larger than they ever anticipated.
He would buy tremendous amounts of things, of course.
Then there are the regular assets.
Warhol could never decide whether he was in it for the money or he was in it to be a great artist. So he made it on both ends. He was a great artist, but he was a heck of a good businessman.
With the help of business manager Fred Hughes, Andy Warhol bought prime real estate. The factory, the townhouse, 2 downtown apartment buildings, 1 co-op, a compound in Montauk, and 40 acres in Colorado.
He had very valuable property, he had some very valuable real estate. He had an ex-garage that John Paul Basquiat lived in.
He had stock in Boeing, General Motors, and IBM, life insurance policies of $4.5 million, and plenty of cold, hard cash. He owned Andy Warhol Enterprises, an Interview magazine, and all of his original unsold art. The sheer volume of what's left is overwhelming. More than 5,000 drawings, 19,000 prints, and 66,000 photographs.
I suppose he must have produced more works than any other artist that ever lived, possibly.
In the spring of 1988, Fred Hughes orchestrates a massive 10-day sale of Andy's townhouse treasures. That's just the collectibles, not his original art.
Well, of course, the event of the auction was a colossal event in the art world.
So there were just endless numbers of what they call lots, which is groups of things that you sell. And it was just a tremendous success. Sotheby's did a fabulous job, too.
The auction brings in $25.3 million to the estate. It's far more than Sotheby's experts could have imagined. With Andy's real estate holdings, companies, and investments, that brings the total of Andy's non-art assets to more than $119 million.
You had a lot of beautiful antique furniture that sold for $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 a piece. He just had terrific stuff, and it sold for top dollar. Everybody wanted a piece of Andy Warhol.
18 months after Andy's death, Fred Hughes and a factory helper have come up with an appraisal of the estate, including the art, for federal taxes, $300 million. If that appraisal stands, the foundation will be expected to give away 5% of its total asset value. That's $15 million. Ed Hayes' 2% cut means he could make almost $6 million. That's when a new person comes onto the scene who doesn't trust Fred Hughes' appraisal. Archibald Gillies, the newly named president of the foundation.
He was kind of part of the foundation world in this town. He ran it. So he had a real interest in seeing one way or another a certain sum of money being attached to the value of the estate.
Gillies questions the validity of the $300 million appraisal done for estate tax purposes. And he's concerned about the 2% cut that Ed Hayes is supposed to take home, which amounts to almost $6 million.
The foundation took the position that I was trying to inflate the value to increase my fee. And I said, look, this estate was very successful because we had increased the value of the art by an enormous amount. You know, in my mind, I'm worth $1 trillion. Others may disagree. So they felt that I was asking for too much money.
Andy Warhol kind of receded into the background, and a whole bunch of dollar signs became the motivating force behind everybody's opinions about Andy Warhol.
At around the same time, Warhol's estate executor Fred Hughes falls ill, and Ed Hayes worries it's affecting his judgment.
Fred Hughes was getting sick. He had multiple sclerosis.
Hayes catches Hughes on the phone selling an original Warhol painting to a Swiss dealer from Hughes's own private collection. Hayes believes the Swiss dealer is paying a premium for paintings in Hughes' collection, and in return, getting a discount on work he buys from the estate. Hayes feels betrayed by his longtime friend and colleague.
It'd be one thing if he was desperate, but he wasn't desperate. He just wanted endless amounts of money. He's like these Wall Street guys who, no matter how much they get, it's not enough.
Hughes has another problem. His private art collection includes a large number of unsigned works, believed to be authentic Warhols.
They were all unsigned. Warhol would not sign a painting until he transferred ownership, right? So Hughes couldn't sell them unless they were signed.
Gillies cuts Hughes a deal. If Hughes gives up his place on the board and fires Ed Hayes, then the foundation will verify ownership of Fred's collection of unsigned paintings.
Hughes made a deal with the foundation that he would help them against me, and he would agree to their valuation if they would accept his ownership of the art.
This doesn't sit well with Hayes, but Hughes accepts the offer anyway, and Hayes gets fired.
It meant that the person should have been my most important ally turned against me. He was the godfather to my daughter. He had given me the opportunity of a lifetime. I felt betrayed. I was betrayed, and I was furious at him.
Hayes and Hughes are on the outs, and the Andy Warhol estate is about to be embroiled in another fight. A fight which may have its roots in one of the most dramatic events in the artist's life. June 3rd, 1968, Andy Warhol is at the factory when Valerie Solanas, an extreme feminist writer who acted in one of Andy's films with Ultraviolet, shows up, demanding money.
So I had a certain acquaintance with Valerie, and she had given Andy one of her play, I think Up Your House, and she was trying to recover it, and Andy did not have it, did not find it, did not return it. She believed that he was going to take the story and use it and make money, and she wanted revenge.
Solanas pulls out a revolver and starts firing. At first, she misses Andy, but her third and final bullet is delivered to Andy's abdomen, tearing through 6 internal organs.
And that day, she never wore makeup. That day, she had lipstick. So she knew she was going to do something, and she knew she was going to be in the news, and she knew she was going to be finally famous for 15 minutes.
Miraculously, Andy survives. Solanus is tried, serves 3 years in prison, and eventually drifts into obscurity. But beyond a painful recovery, the shooting has another profound effect on Andy Warhol.
His life is punctuated between before and after he was shot.
Andy becomes paranoid. He changes studios to a more secure facility. The new factory has locked doors and an air of efficiency.
And then he realized that the era of the crazies was over. And so he also changed factories, and there was, like you couldn't just get in. You had to say who you were. So things changed completely.
The shooting affects Andy in another way.
When we would walk, for example, to Sotheby's, he would have to walk on the other side of the street from New York Hospital.
Andy's fear will prove prophetic.
Andy's horror of hospitals went to the point where he would say that if I ever go into a hospital, I know I'll never come out, thus predicting his own death that came true.
Andy's phobia makes him reluctant to seek treatment, even when he needs it.
Well, he was always, of course, in pain from his gallbladder condition.
Andy's doctor urges him to go to the hospital. He visits a crystal healer instead.
Give Andy little crystals, and Andy would put them in a little pocket near his gallbladder, thinking that it was going to help him.
The pain from his gallbladder becomes unbearable for Andy in the middle of a fashion show.
Andy was a Ford model, and so there was a fashion show in a sort of a nightclub called The Tunnel, which was an old subway tunnel, as a matter of fact, way downtown there. And the moment it was over, he said, "Stuart, get me out of here." And we practically dragged him out.
Andy Warhol finally checks himself in to New York Hospital.
When Warhol entered the hospital, he asked the nurse, are there any famous people here? And the nurse said, "No, Mr. Warhol, you're the most famous."
Andy's gangrenous gallbladder is removed, and he seems to be on the mend. But at some point in the early hours of the morning, he has a heart attack. By 5:45 a.m., when his private duty nurse calls for help, he's blue. On his death certificate, in the space for cause of death, it says unclassified.
Just, a heart-wrenching time in my life, And my dad was a little upset that Andy didn't let him know, because he would have been right there at his side. But maybe that's something he didn't want.
In 1990, the Foundation's board members launch a wrongful death suit on behalf of Andy's brothers. They allege the doctors, nurses, and interns were negligent that night at New York Hospital. Meantime, the Foundation, with Archibald Gillies at the helm, hires Christie's auction house to do a second, more professional appraisal. Their experts devote more than 600 hours in its preparation. A lower appraisal will mean that the Foundation will pay out less to the state of New York every year.
They came in with a new estimate that cut the value of the estate dramatically.
There's so much art that Christie's applies what amounts to a bulk discount. Jeffrey Hoffeld is an art historian and appraiser.
The theory is that if you were attempting to sell the works on that one calendar day, you would have to apply a discount to them in order to have them pass smoothly into the market.
With the discount, Christie's says Andy's work is worth only $95 million.
Nobody, except an absolute cretin, right, would do it that way. You sell the art over time to maximize the value, and you sell the art every year in order to make the next year's art more profitable.
The new figure stands in stark contrast to the previous $300 million appraisal, and lawyer Ed Hayes, who's already been paid $4.8 million, faces the prospect of having to give some of the money back.
I am not the good fairy. I did not work like an animal for 5 or 6 years and want to watch somebody take it from me.
Hayes suspects the foundation and Christie's could be in cahoots to keep the art's value deliberately low. He hires Jeffrey Hoffeld to do yet another appraisal.
Ed had been promised that he would receive a percentage of the value of the estate, and Ed wanted to make sure he was getting a fair deal.
Hoffeld takes into account a larger volume of Andy's work than the Christie's appraisal and applies a different methodology.
I've never done a valuation of this scale, and I hope never to have to again.
When Hoffeld is finished, he contends all those Marilyns and Jackies and Campbell's soup cans are worth a staggering amount of money.
Hoffeld came in and said, Ed, if I tell you what I really think this is worth, even you won't believe me. I think that Warhol is the American Picasso. This art is worth 5 or 6 times what they say it's worth.
In contrast to Christie's $95 million evaluation, Jeffrey Hoffeld and his team say Andy's estate is worth more than $500 million. With the regular assets, that could bring the total estate value to $708 million.
The difference of valuation was just a gaping, cavernous hole.
As the gap widens, Andy Warhol's estate lawyers get ready for court in the wrongful death suit launched against New York Hospital. Long Island malpractice lawyer Bruce Clark joins the team 3 weeks before trial.
Suddenly they had a realization that maybe they were not medical malpractice lawyers, so they contacted me, and here I am.
The trial is short, but ugly.
We learned that there was a physician who was from the New York hospital, the hospital in which Warhol died, who was present at the autopsy. Now that's a really unusual thing. In my entire career of 30 plus years, I've seen a physician at an autopsy once who was not affiliated with the medical examiner's office.
Estate lawyers allege Andy was pumped with an IV solution and morphine and left with a girdle around his abdomen, then left unsupervised all night long.
The final straw of this perfect storm is that he hired a private duty nurse at the advice of his private physician. The private duty nurse came on duty at 8 o'clock and looked in at him, took his record and wrote in the record, 8 p.m. to 8 a.m., slept all night without problems.
Andy dies at 6:21 a.m. His estate's legal team alleges the artist thrashed and fought for oxygen before slipping into a fatal coma. 3 weeks into the trial, Andy's heirs settle with New York Hospital for an undisclosed sum. Both sides say they're happy with the settlement.
When family loses a loved person, it's a terrible trauma, and it leaves a big open wound that has to be healed, and maybe can never totally heal, but I think one of the functions of a wrongful death lawsuit is to give closure to the family.
The dispute over the value of Andy's art doesn't wrap up so easily. By the spring of 1992, negotiations break down, and Ed Hayes files a lawsuit, alleging the foundation is price-fixing Andy Warhol's work and robbing the public.
They essentially said, well, you didn't do that good a job. The value of the art did not go up that much. You're not entitled to that money. But that was not the real issue. The real issue was how the charity was going to be run.
The New York State Attorney General sides with the foundation and files suit against Hayes, accusing him of fraud and demanding an outrageous legal fee unrelated to the necessary legal work.
Seemed a kind of specious argument to make, because the greater the value of the estate, the greater the tax revenues that would flow to the federal government and to New York State would have been. So what was he doing arguing against it?
Whether it was political influence, whether it was the AG offended by the amount of fees that Ed would earn. It was bewildering at the time.
In November 1993, the valuation hearing begins in New York Surrogate Court. Judge Eve Preminger decides the trial will be heard in two parts. First, the value of Andy's estate will be determined. Then the court will decide on Ed Hayes' fee.
Yeah, look, I'm like most lawyers, I'm a maniac for publicity, and I made sure to dress up and talk as much as I could, so I'm no saint.
Both sides hire appraisers and economists to support their positions in the first part of the trial.
And the difference between a little and a lot was the difference between $90 million and $500 million.
The foundation lawyers argue that the court should accept Christie's appraisal of $95 million. They say Edward Hayes is guided entirely by greed. Edward Hayes' team counters that it's the foundation that's greedy and that its legal team is ruthless.
Before being deposed for the trial, I became aware of the fact that a private detective was gathering information about me and asking around town to various people and perhaps trailing me. And I come from a scholarly academic background, and this were new treacherous waters for me.
Jeffrey Hoffeld testifies on behalf of Ed Hayes. His testimony has a powerful effect on the court. He exposes some very shady dealings.
I discovered, looking at the estate's own sales records, an enormous gap in value between what Christie's had attributed to works and what the estate was actually selling similar in-kind works for.
Then Hayes presents proof that Christie's was in talks with the foundation to sell Andy Warhol's art. At the same time, that it was supposed to be giving an impartial appraisal.
The foundation went to Christie's and said, if you'll give us a lower appraisal, we'll give you the right to sell the art. Unfortunately, they did some of that in writing. And at some point we discovered those documents, and of course, that ended up with some people having a bad day.
Judge Preminger's decision states that the evidence does not rise to collusion, but demonstrates a conflict on the part of Christie's.
Christie's was striving for a lower appraisal because of the marching orders it received from the estate and foundation.
Journalists who cover the trial seem to relish in the hypocrisy of the millions paid to lawyers to argue against other lawyers' fees.
Like anything involving large sums of money, got bloody, right?
At some point, they just lost sense of the comic value of what this thing that they were participating in.
A verdict is imminent, but the fight over Andy's millions isn't over yet.
Isn't that what lawyers do? They try and weasel some dough out of the guy who's not around to object. They succeeded.
Andy Warhol's artwork is worth anywhere from $95 million to almost $600 million. And a judge is about to decide which figure is right. In April 1994, Judge Eve Preminger takes the middle ground.
It was a very unusual experience for me to find myself in and to be playing what turned out to be such a pivotal role in the final determination.
The judge rules Andy's art was worth $391 million on the day of his death, less than Jeffrey Hoffeld's valuation, but far more than Christie's.
We absolutely rejoiced and felt great when the judge's opinion came in. It was clearly supportive of our findings and highly critical of the approach used by Christie's and the endorsement by the estate and foundation of the Christie's appraisal.
The ruling on Ed Hayes' fee comes a year later. The court rules Hayes' 2% demand is unenforceable and deems his services are worth $7.2 million.
I was going to make an awful lot of money. My mother never made more than about $4 an hour, all right? I'm not saying I'm an angel, but I don't want to get robbed, okay?
The foundation appeals, complaining that Hayes is too cozy with the judge, and Hayes's fees are reduced to $3.5 million.
I had given a couple $100 to Premige's campaign. In the first place, she didn't even know. I mean, it was stupid. The woman is from the Premige family. You think she cares about $200 or $250?
Ed Hayes and the foundation fight to a stalemate in 1999. Both claim to have won.
How long did this thing really go on? In a way, it was kind of like a Dickens novel. It was like Bleak House.
I think of myself as a hard man, and I said, I can handle this problem, and I would handle it. And I swore I would get revenge.
I think that Ed got a very raw deal in this situation, but I continue to believe that it had to do with wanting to come out with a lowball valuation for the estate in order to reduce the obligation to charitable giving by the foundation.
I felt I had been embarrassed in front of my mother. And my mother had worked as a minimum wage employee at Macy's.
When Hayes learns the foundation lawyer was responsible for the judge's appointment, he files a formal complaint and gives the story to the New York Times.
I'm proud, as cruel as it sounds, I'm proud that I got revenge, and that's it.
In January 2001, Warhol's manager Fred Hughes dies from complications resulting from his 18-year battle with multiple sclerosis. He's remembered as a brilliant and complicated man.
I adored Hughes. Gave me a great opportunity. He was a genius. He stuck by me when people criticized me. But you know, at the end, he was sick and he was greedy.
He was, for me, a very sympathetic character. It was already evident at the time I got to know him that Fred was suffering from the onset of multiple sclerosis, but I saw his brilliance clearly, and I also saw his capacity for duplicity in this time.
Well, there's a lot of beautiful things in the art world, but yeah, there's some sleaze and treachery. There was with Warhol. It was terrible what happened there.
Despite its troubles early on, the foundation continues to support emerging artists, and it has helped to establish the Andy Warhol Museum, a Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh devoted to Andy's legacy.
The Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts has done so much in the last 25 years. They've helped with grants into the hundreds of millions of dollars for art programs and ventures, and I think Andy would be proud of what they have done, you know.
The Warhol Foundation has been very generous and has done a great deal for the public good in many domains, but its obligation to do so might have been even stronger and on a greater level.
Andy Warhol's work today is worth more than his closest friends and family could ever have imagined.
Yeah, in the 25 years since he passed away, it's just phenomenal how his popularity has grown and grown. And
on a regular basis, single works by Warhol sell for tens of millions of dollars at auction and privately, which really makes the numbers that we generated look as if they were a throwback to another era. And of course, the Christie's numbers look ludicrous in comparison.
At one point, I owned Elvis 49 times. And in a very brilliant move, about a year later, I sold it to Leo Castelli for $70,000. It's worth about $50 million today.
A bumper from an automobile or a soup can or a Coke can, you know, he's the one who made us look at those things as objects of art.
You know, Warhol, whatever you say about Warhol, that he was a genius, it's true. That he was an idiot, it's true. That he had imagination, it's true. That he copied everything, it's true. Whatever you say about him that's conflicting is true. And I find that quite extraordinary.